Good morning. I'm Jeff Hammond, Executive Director at International Ground Source Heat Pump Association. Thank you for joining us for the April Dig Deeper webinar. We're excited to have a couple of speakers talking about the investment tax credit. Before we turn it over to our guests, I have just a few announcements on IGSHPA and the industry. So we'll get started with that, and then we will turn it over to our speakers. So there are a lot going on with IGSHPA. Hopefully you saw us at the conference last week. If not, there's a lot of other information going on as well. So the Town Hall and Dig Deeper webinars are listed in our training and events on IGSHPA.org. You can see here in the screenshot, if you go to that location, you'll find the listing of all of the webinars, but also there's a link there for submitting abstracts. We'd love to hear from you. There's so many cool projects and applications and so forth. So if you want to speak at one of these webinars, just submit an abstract, and we'll take a look at our calendars and see if we can to meet. Also, we still have web advertising available for the webinars. It's a great way to get your name out there. They are recorded, so you'll see your logo on the intro, for as long as they're online, which we don't plan to take those off. If you were at the annual conference last week in St. Charles, Missouri, thank you very much. We had one of the best conferences ever. We were over 400 attendees, and we sold out the exhibit hall. We had a lot of sponsors, which we appreciate very much. We could not do this conference without our sponsors and exhibitors, and especially our attendees and presenters. So thank you for everything last week. Hopefully you enjoyed the conference if you attended it. And next year we'll be in the same location. More information to come on next year's conference. Every other year we have the research conference. This year it is in Vienna, Austria, towards the end of May. And so if you want to make a trip to Vienna, it's great to learn about all the latest research going on. This is not like our normal annual conferences where we have exhibitors. This is papers and presentations. And this is with the IEA. This year, last year was our last conference 2 years ago was in Montreal. So this does move around, and we work with other associations on the research part of it. We certainly could use your help on the project database and also licensing and CEE requirements. This is a resource for the industry. As we grow as an industry, this is really important that we have projects online so that you can refer to all the different types of ground source heat pumps. If you're not receiving our Geo Outlook magazine, make sure you send us an email or give us a call. This is a pretty decent magazine. It has a lot of great articles. It has space there for advertising, and we have about 6,500 individuals this goes out to. So we'd love to hear from you. Tell us about your applications, the latest installation of ground source heat pumps. And if you'd like to advertise, this is an online magazine. So again, like the Town Hall and Dig Deeper webinars, you'll find them indefinitely on the website. If you'd like to get CEUs for your certification renewals, just put your name and email address in the chat or Q&A, and we'll keep track of those for you. If you happen to be watching this as a recording, you can still get those CEUs. You just simply need to submit that webinar code that you see on the screen as you request the CEUs. You do not need this code if you're attending live. So nothing changes if you're live, but if you're watching this as a recording, you'll need that code in order to get those CEUs. Just a little housekeeping. Once we start the presentation, we do have your microphones muted. So if you could put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A, then when the presentation's over, we'll go through those questions. If we don't get to your message today, then we'll do our best to get back to you as soon as possible. We're also recording this session, so you'll be able to view this later on. Just check IGSHPA.org for a link to that recording. And just another note here, because of security settings, sometimes you will have to accept an invite for Q&A so that you can use it. If you can't use Q&A and you can't use chat, then just raise your hand and I'll unmute your microphone so that you can speak your question. We've had pretty good luck with people being able to use either chat or Q&A so far, so we haven't had too many problems with this lately. Teams continues to have updates and gets better the more we use it. And then lastly, before I introduce our speakers, I do need to read this disclaimer and conflict of interest. The upcoming presentation presents the opinion of the presenter and does not represent any official position, opinion, or endorsement of any products or services by IGSHPA or its members. IGSHPA town halls and Dig Deeper webinars are for member updates and education on the latest information in the geothermal heat pump industry and are not meant to endorse one technology brand over another. It's the presenter's responsibility to disclose any conflict of interest or position that may arise in the content of the webinar. All right, so now I am happy to introduce Mr. Josh Howes, the CEO, and Mr. David Diaz, Chief Strategy Officer. Gentlemen, feel free to share your screen whenever you like. Josh Howes is a professional engineer licensed in all 50 states and has been an advocate and leader in all things related to the Energy Tax Code since 2011. He is the CEO of Walker Blue, LLC, a national leader in energy tax incentives and energy engineering, specializing in 179D and 45L tax certifications, ITC, domestic content, and prevailing wage compliance. David Diaz is the Chief Strategy Officer at Walker Blue, where he leads the firm's energy tax incentive and energy engineering practices. He's a nationally recognized expert in the investment tax credit and the Section 179D energy efficient commercial buildings deduction, with more than 20 years of experience supporting energy and infrastructure projects. David works with ESCOs, CPAs, architects, engineers, and public sector and nonprofit owners to structure and document ITC and 179D strategies that are compliant, defensible, and aligned with project design and construction. He's a frequent speaker on federal energy tax incentives and advises clients nationwide on incentive optimization and risk management. It's my pleasure to turn it over to Josh and David. Thank you guys for joining us this morning.
Thanks, Jeff. Really appreciate the intro, and we're excited to be here together with IGSHPA. We recently attended the conference, and I'm going to start putting away my casino money for next year. Now that I know it's going to be at the same location, so I'll start creating a little side pot there in my underwear drawer, so that I can hang. So a little bit about us, Walker Blue. Like Jeff mentioned, we're a specialty energy tax incentive provider. We do a ton of different things in that space, but have, as the geothermal world has grown, we have grown with it, and a large majority of the work that we do in the investment tax credit space is related to geothermal and geothermal heat pump projects. So our firm was a recent merger between Walker Reed Strategies and Blue Energy Group. So we're coming up here almost on a year, and in a couple months we'll be a year merged, and so excited to be here, excited to be part of IGSHPA and this community. So thank you. A little bit about what we're going to go through today. So we're going to be looking at, some of the ITC basics. Some of that might be high level and repeated information for you all. We'll look at, reasons to pursue the ITC, bonus credit opportunities, aggregation challenges, elements of maximizing the ITC and where those opportunities lie. Talk a little bit about project timing and how that plays into the investment tax credit. Go through the PWA requirements and compliance. Discuss domestic content and the importance of having early ITC partnerships to make those projects successful. So as many of you are well aware, what has boomeranged the investment tax credit and the opportunity here has been since the Inflation Reduction Act. That's really when we saw a handful of different opportunities around monetizing the investment tax credit. One, they added the transferability element and the ability to transfer these credits if your owners don't have the tax appetite. They added the ability for government and tax exempt entities to receive a direct payment directly from the IRS A lot of the work that we do is based around holding folks' hands through that direct payment process. And then they ended up adding a handful of bonus credits for different components, low income bonus credits, energy community bonus credits, and really expanded the investment tax credit and its viability pretty substantially. They did add the prevailing wage and apprenticeship rules as part of that. But there's a lot of good that came out of as much as PWA may be a little bit of a pain, there's a lot of good that came out of the Inflation Reduction Act. On the bright side, when the big beautiful bill came around, we had the opportunity to have the geothermal piece for the ITC essentially be untouched from what was proposed in the Inflation Reduction Act. So, geothermal and the ITC for geothermal heat pumps is here, hopefully to stay. It doesn't, it didn't get chopped in this big beautiful bill that we had last year. So we don't expect there to be much of a change here moving forward, at least not negatively speaking. Maybe there's some positive changes in the future, but that's kind of where that stands from a from legislative perspective. So a lot of times, a lot of the conversations that we have to have with your all's clients are, you know, conversations to provide certainty, because there's a lot of fear with sometimes with these credits. They think they may go away or they could get pulled. So we can help on kind of helping your clients clarify and understand the legislative background to the incentives, and how the Congress and the IRS typically do things if they are going to phase out projects like they have with solar and credits. Those are things that we can kind of help navigate a little bit and give some certainty behind as well. So, all right. So why pursue the ITC? The ITC can materially improve the financial viability of geothermal projects. We do feasibility analysis on a regular basis on air source heat pumps versus ground source heat pumps, and how the ITC comes in and affects potentially those opportunities. So whether it's a third party ownership structure and they're going to go use tax equity to monetize the tax credits and transfer them or keep them, or it's direct pay. Those are all things that potentially are adding a ton of value. Realistically, you guys as an industry, I like to say you're on sale. Anywhere from 40 to 70% off is what the ITC is really doing for the ground source heat pump industry. So a lot of great opportunities there when it comes to using the ITC as a tool in your toolbox as you're designing, developing, or bringing projects to fruition here. So a little bit on how it works. We start here at the bottom. There's a 6% base ITC credit. So 6%, that's automatic essentially of the eligible integral ITC basis. That 6% is a give me. That everybody hears about the 30% or the 40%. The way it works is that 6% gets multiplied by 5 once you meet the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements, or you are exempt from the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. And we're going to get into how that works in a future slide here. But just, for the most part, the 30% is pretty realistic if you have early engagement on larger projects or projects that are under a megawatt. They're kind of automatically going to qualify for that 30% base credit. There's a 10% opportunity for domestic content. And we'll get into how that works as well. So if the project meets the domestic content thresholds and requirements, we right now, the only methodology for us to go and achieve that is the cost basis methodology. I was excited, Ryan Dougherty from was at the conference, and he mentioned that they're working strongly with Congress here to get safe harbor tables, hopefully in the near future, put out, which will be a great benefit for the heat pump industry. So that's something to be on the lookout for. That's coming here in the near future, we hope. And but if not, Josh and I have kind of figured out and cracked the code a little bit on how to get that 10% domestic content. And we've, big push that we've been doing, as many, some of y'all are here on this call. Big reason we've been to a lot of these heat pump conferences and here recently is to create relationships with the manufacturers to be able to get the information that we need to be able to substantiate that 10% domestic content for you and your clients. So 10% energy community is an energy community bonus for certain sites. That one is basically, a luck of the draw situation. Does your project happen to land in the energy community map? And then there's you get an additional 10% if it does. Something we can check and verify for you. And then the 10 to 20% for low-income communities, that's an application-based program that may or may not make sense for that project, depending on the situation. So, all right, I'll turn it over to Josh and let Josh get into the weeds a little bit.
Thanks, Dave. Nice to meet everybody. So some of the critical elements of maximizing your ITC, obviously, the big one is the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirement. If you're over a megawatt, your base deduction or your base tax credit is 6%. And in order to get that multiplied by 5, you have to meet the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. And if you do that, it becomes a 30% basis for your tax credit. So, this is essentially the biggest, element of maximizing your ITC. It's the one we pay the most attention to. It's the hardest one to meet, of course, as well. So, it's something we're going to go through here in a little more detail. The domestic content works the same way. So it's a basis of 2%. If you meet PWA, then you automatically get the 5 times bonus. So then it becomes a 10% tax credit. So again, this one is a nice adder in the geothermal heating and cooling world. This is achievable. It's very achievable. So we see a lot of domestic content bonuses on the tax credits that we're filing. So both of these, if you're over a megawatt, if you pay close enough attention to these, both of these are achievable. So we see a lot of 40% tax credits going out the door, where if they're in an energy community, that adds another 10%. So that could be 50%. So we're seeing a lot of 40 and 50% tax credits go out the door. So it's critical that, when you're developing your projects, that you're paying attention to prevailing wage and apprenticeship, whether you're over or under a megawatt. And you're also paying attention to domestic content. The third component on this slide is the eligible cost basis. So what we're talking about there is basically making sure that we're taking care of our documentation and we're properly putting that somewhere so that we can allocate these costs correctly. Some costs are not able to be included in our cost basis for our ITC. A lot of them are when we're doing, geothermal. So we need to be able to easily identify when, say, an electrician, for instance, is working on the geothermal system versus just the generic electrical system of the building. And if we can have good documentation and properly allocate these man hours and these material costs to the geothermal system, then we can maximize our ITC better instead of just, taking blind guesses at maybe, what these costs did or didn't, go for. So if we have to get into that kind of a situation, a lot of times we're eliminating costs that we should be able to be included. But just because we didn't have good documentation, we're having to eliminate some costs that we aren't sure of, whether they apply to the geothermal system or not. So let's jump to the next slide there.
Yeah. One of the main things we see as we've been seeing it a lot, especially on new construction projects, is, not planning around that prevailing wage and apprenticeship on the front end, and folks losing out on that higher tax credit amount. So that's super important there. You keep going there, Josh.
Sure thing. So project timing, this determines basically the when the contract is signed with the, whether it's a prime contractor or an EPC contractor. The timing of that contract dictates our prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements, for instance. So when that contract's signed, that locks in the wage determinations for what we're going to have to use on the project. So that way, we all know from, from the owner's standpoint and from the contractor standpoint and the subcontractor standpoint, what wages are needing to be paid, because we've locked in that project start date. Right now, geothermal doesn't have a lot of expiration dates any in the near future, so we're not as concerned about start dates when it comes to, being eligible for the geothermal ITC. Though, the ITC runs through 2035. It doesn't, it starts phasing out in 33. So we've got plenty of time to get these projects started. But sometimes, tax years matter. If you're trying to complete them by certain dates, the timing of these payments. And I'll just address it here because I'm not sure we have it in the slideshow anywhere. So starting and completing these projects, can help and hurt cash flow depending on how your tax year falls, right? So if you're a calendar, let's just say keep it easy, then and you operate on a calendar tax year, and you complete your project in February, you have to wait all the way until December to, before your tax year runs out, and then file your tax return the following year. So whether it's a tax credit that you're getting, or if it's a direct payment that you're getting, those are not coming until, a year, maybe 18 months after the project's completed because of the timing issue. So you want to make sure that your timing, whether you're starting it on time or you're completing it on time, falls into, where you're understanding how these tax credits are going to flow once the project's finished. Like I said, there's no, FEOC's kind of over now. That it didn't apply to heating and cooling aspects of geothermal anyway. So we're not worried about FEOC generally when we're talking about a heating and cooling geothermal system. We're not worried about ITC expiring just yet. These will come a little bit more critical in 2033. But from a cash flow standpoint, project timing is huge. So we'll touch real short on aggregation and multi-building. We have a lot of projects where we may have geothermal on one, let's say it's on one tract of land, and it's serving multiple buildings, right? And so if you add up all of these geothermal systems across all these buildings, we're going to be over a megawatt. There are ways to structure and design your geothermal system correctly and phase them in, and do project phases of these multiple buildings to where you can get these under a megawatt and treat each building as a separate geothermal system. The aggregation word comes where we say we have 4 different geothermal systems serving 4 different buildings, and we're forced by the IRS to aggregate those into one and treat those as one big project, which now puts us under prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements in order to get that bonus. So we need to be paying attention to these things. There's a lot of rules around aggregation. There's a 7-point test that we walk through. And, if we can check less than 4 of these boxes, then we don't have to aggregate. So when we're developing these projects, it's important to consider maybe there's a way to, phase this project in, or better design this to where it's more clearly four separate systems than just one big system sharing, pumps and things of that nature. So it doesn't always mean that that's how we're going to design it. It doesn't mean that we're going to avoid aggregation, but it's just a discussion to be considerate of when we're developing projects. And so we always emphasize trying to get your tax advisors involved early on these projects during development so that you can talk through some of these issues about maybe can we de-aggregate this project and split it up to where we can avoid prevailing wage and apprenticeship. That's kind of a pain, but so is prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. That's kind of a pain. So it may be a pain point on either way, and you can determine for yourself which pain point you want to take on and which one you want to try to avoid.
I'll help explain a little bit on the PWA pain point in particular, because it really can be, like Josh was mentioning, a benefit to find a way, and we always recommend if you can keep the project under 284 tons, that's the best way to go. If you're slightly over, maybe we consider some design changes and some things to see if it makes sense. But so for PWA, like we mentioned, it's necessary in order to get that 6% up to 30% based on the whether or not it's exempt or non-exempt based on the size being over or under a megawatt. So we do have to use the Department of Labor wage rates that are relevant to that job within the jurisdiction in which that job is being constructed. There's important, most companies don't have issues with the actual prevailing wage part of it. The apprenticeship part was the part that was a little new and unique, that came up as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, and it's the one that causes most folks the heartache. So it is important currently, if any projects you're doing that need to meet this requirement, you need to have 15% of the total labor hours on that job meeting the apprenticeship hours and ratios. It's important that you guys get those payroll records on a weekly basis. There's apprenticeship to journeyman ratios as well, which are super important. They have to be maintained on a daily basis based on the apprenticeship documents. And it's important to kind of catch these things in real time. So Walker Blue, we offer a service where we do continuous monitoring on projects. And the main reason we do that is, sure, we could come in at the end of a project and let you know whether you qualified or not, and at what level you qualified, and whether that qualification occurred or didn't occur, and what the penalties could potentially be. But the benefit of tracking it in real time is that you do have the ability to cure these penalties and cure deficiencies in your prevailing wage. If you catch it in real time, you have until the end, anywhere from 30 to 180 days to do so, depending on when we catch it. So, you have until the end of the first month of the following quarter in which the noncompliance occurred. So, again, this is a way to protect against potentially there being issues on the back end. If these projects get audited by the IRS and it gets figured out that these rules aren't being met, the penalties are much steeper, right? You have the option, you could self-report your penalties if you know about them, but if the IRS catches them, it's 10 times as much. So it can be pretty substantial penalties on those projects. So again, we focus heavy on early contractor engagement and reporting. So we would love to be involved in the design phase before the RFP gets put out for the subs. We love to have some say in the language of your contracts and subcontractor agreements to make sure that everybody involved understands what's going to be required of them. So that's a super important component to kind of get everything moving. And again, we would love to track them in real time, because I think that's that's where we can add the most value. Sure, we can add value coming in on the back end and letting you know where you stand, and you may be, required to do so. If you're transferring this credit and it's being sold and it's not a direct pay job, well, there's the buyer side is going to have their insurance companies, their CPAs. Who are substantiating this credit, and they're going to dig into this. So it's nice to have it tracked on a regular basis, so when you get to that point that they're not going to find anything out of compliance. So, Josh, I'll let you take the domestic content piece.
Yep. So domestic content, like I said, on the heating and cooling side, domestic content is highly achievable. We have a lot of domestic material that goes into a geothermal system. We have piping that goes underground that's often domestically made. We have ductwork, sheet metal that's domestically made. Those two components right there are large cost items. Our heat pumps, while not 100% domestically made, typically are in the 30 to 80% domestic content range. So when you're talking about trying to achieve a threshold of 40%, it's not hard to get there if we're paying attention to domestic content. So the way that it works essentially is right now, like David said, the only way for us to certify domestic content is through the cost method. So what we're having to do is we have to determine not only where the product was manufactured, which if it's not manufactured in the US, it gets a 0% domestic content. If it is manufactured in the US, now we have to go to the manufactured component level. So for a heat pump, that means we have to go to essentially the parts list of that heat pump and determine where each part was manufactured, and do kind of a weighted cost of how much of the costs of these parts were made in the United States and how much of the costs overall do we have inside that heat pump. And then that determines our percentage of domestic content for that heat pump. So we do that for all the components on the project. Pipes not all that difficult, ductwork's not all that difficult because those don't have these subcomponents. But things like pumps, heat pumps, some of the electrical equipment, they have a lot of components in them. So it's a pretty heavy lift for us to actually do a watertight cost analysis of these domestic of the domestic content of a system. But we're pretty built for it. We've been doing this for a while now. We've got good relationships with the manufacturers of a lot of these components that we've been getting data from. But all that to say, we are hopeful that that the IRS will soon issue guidance on a safe harbor method that's hopefully coming before the end of 2026, that allows us to do something that the solar community's been able to do for a little while now, which is basically it's the same concept, but we don't have to do such a deep dive on every single component, say in a heat pump where we're trying to figure out, where 150 different parts came from. There's just going to be a handful of checks that we have to do. Where'd your pipe come from? Where'd your sheet metal come from? A handful of components inside the heat pump, for instance, will be analyzed to determine, where did those come from instead of all of them. So it really simplifies the domestic content for us, and we'll be able to use kind of a cheat sheet that the IRS is going to create for us to easily meet domestic content on these geothermal systems. So it's something we want to pay attention to. It's a fairly, I don't want to say easy 10%, but compared to solar, it's fairly easy to achieve domestic content. So we definitely want to be paying attention to it, and we want to, if you have the opportunity to, help with, calling your congressman, calling your senator on Capitol Hill, and telling them about this safe harbor content. We want to get as much support behind it as we can, so that the IRS, doesn't sit on their hands too much longer, and they go on and get this out there. So, for now, in the time being, how do we approach compliance? Obviously, we mentioned it earlier that the biggest component of this is documentation. So we want to make sure that when we're specing out our components, that we're keeping the documentation, that we're making sure that our when we develop our project, that we're going in with the expectation of meeting domestic content, and that we've kind of done a preliminary analysis on the parts and the components of the system, and we know going in, if we stick to our plan, that we're going to meet domestic content. So we've kind of done that up front. But along with that, as we're ordering these parts and equipment and all of that, that our suppliers understand what we're going to be asking them for from a documentation aspect, and that they provide that for us. It's a lot easier when you're holding a check in your hand saying, I'll give this to you and I'll buy your stuff if you give me these documents, than it is to have already given them the check and you've got your stuff, and now you're chasing them for documents that they don't really have any reason to supply us because the job's already been done. So we want to engage them early, make sure that they understand if they're going to supply for us on this project, the documentation requirement that we're going to expect from them. And then after that, it's just a matter of maintaining those records, tracking our costs, keeping good records. And then if any change orders come up, if we have supply issues and we're having to, kind of change gears and go with a different manufacturer, for instance, that we've kind of done that analysis, and we know that, if we do switch, it's not going to hurt us too bad, or if it does hurt us, that it doesn't hurt us so much that we fall below the required domestic content that we're going after. So. So yeah, not to belabor the point, but obviously where projects break up is when we don't have that documentation, right? And I kind of explained it. So if we're asking for documentation after the project's over, we're not going to get very good documentation. And so now we're going to be relying on, marketing material, whatever we can find on the website. And that's just not a very good place to be. Whether the audit risk is low, it may still be a conversation that we have with you as the taxpayer to say, look, we think you met domestic content, but we just can't really back it up with certainty. So, if you get audited, we're going to have trouble. We're going to be chasing our tail a little bit, trying to prove that the domestic content was met, because we just didn't have the good documentation. And so we don't really want to be in that position. So we want to definitely be asking for this stuff up front. And then obviously, if we're having to change gears, if we're not paying attention to domestic content throughout the project, and there's a lot of change orders, and we're changing a lot of our suppliers around, and we're not paying attention to that, that can cost us in the end to say, oh, I didn't know that heat pump that it was made in Mexico, and so now that's a 0% domestic content, and that's going to hurt us. So we just want to pay attention to these things before the project starts and throughout the project if we have any changes. So yeah, we did have a project here recently where we came in on the end, and we're still chasing documentation, but we think we've got it under control now at the 11th hour. But these things do happen where we're brought in late on a project. We felt like we met domestic content. We kind of know these manufacturers, and we kind of know that we're going to be over the threshold, but we just couldn't prove it out on paper, right? So we're having to really make a lot of extra phone calls to these manufacturers, try to get into the right people, and try to get the documentation so we can prove it out. So ultimately, we're able to secure that documentation, but time isn't always on our side, especially when we're having to file for the direct pay, because you can't file that late. It has to be filed on time when the tax return's due. So we have deadlines that are coming up that we can't get around, and we either have the documentation or we don't. So we want to make sure that, again, that we're not chasing the documentation to try to prove domestic content. with a month to go, for instance, before we have to file our tax returns.
I'm going to skip a couple slides, Josh, just because we're running up here on time coming up soon. So I want to make sure we have time for questions and whatnot as well. So again, we've been mentioning it. What does an early partnership look like? How partnership supports project teams. So, it's important to define ITC boundaries during the design phase if possible. Anything we can do to help write the domestic content language into specs and RFPs, help write the PWA language into specs and RFPs. Those are things that we can add some value early on in the process. Start coordinating, like Josh was mentioning, the data request early from your manufacturers, and make sure we're kind of aligning engineering, procurement, and tax requirements all together, right? They're all interconnected. They all make a difference to one another. So making sure that we have a good gauge on that early on to make sure we protect the tax credits is a critical component, and it prevents those last minute fire drills. So again, why kind of engage experts, right? We're all smart here. We got a group of really, really intelligent engineers and developers and project contractors and whatnot. Could you navigate some of the tax things on your own? Maybe, we're not saying you can't, but it's super, we do recommend from a couple of different perspectives. One, it strengthens the independence factor when it comes to these filings with the IRS. So having an independent third party, or having the taxpayer have an independent third party, like Walker Blue, come in and be that guiding light that substantiates these incentives, that carries a ton of weight in audits, right? So, we've been doing this for a really long time. We've been through, hundreds of IRS audits at this point, where we have a really good understanding of what it looks like. So everything we do from a substantiation perspective comes out in a fashion that we're trying to make sure that once the auditor looks at our report, that goes away. The audit is no longer an issue. They understand that it's been substantiated, and it doesn't weaken the position. So again, having audits, support documentation, we want to overwhelm that auditor and make them go, okay, well, this is well documented, and this is well over my head as an IRS auditor to get into all these energy components. And look, this taxpayer went the extra step and didn't try to just come up with this number on their own. They hired an independent third party to be the one to help them. We never, charge on a contingency basis. We're not really allowed to. And again, that further weakens that substantiation position. So everything we do is based on the time and effort that we're going to spend working on these projects. So we're never trying to get a percentage of the credit or whatnot, because at the end of the day, we want to keep that curtain of independence between the taxpayer, the developers, and all the parties that are involved in the process to help navigate that and substantiate it from an IRS's perspective. So, Josh, you want to get into? We got big project we did in Texas recently. We've a lot of people have seen this case study on LinkedIn. It's been getting a lot of traction. I want to say we're going viral in the ground source heat pump community with this, but I'll let Josh kind of take over, because you were critical on this project from a development perspective.
So it's not the dollar amount might be a little, I don't know, alarming. I don't know what the right word is, but as far as the results, they're not atypical. I mean, we're like I said, we're seeing a lot of direct payments being issued from the IRS these days. So, the success is not surprising. But this was just an exceptionally large geothermal system. We were over 1,000 tons. So it was just a really big system. So obviously it cost a lot of money, and it resulted in a large ITC payment. But I think the part I want to point out here is that they did get their check. So it's real. It's not a pie in the sky idea. ITC money is being issued by the IRS as long as the right paperwork's being filed and we have all of our ducks in a row. These checks are being issued and these checks cash when they go in the bank. So, this one was, again, this particular one was over a megawatt, obviously, but it didn't have to meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship because they began prior to January 29th of 23, which also gives you a PWA exemption regardless of size. So that was a fortunate piece of this one. So, but outside of that, like I said, it's not surprising that they got their money because this is law, this is legislation. We take a lot of these questions from the community of like, hey, am I going to lose my ITC? Can Congress pass a law and take it away and da da da? I mean, yes, they can, but if you're already under construction, you're safe. So, and these checks are being issued, and we don't see this going away. They had their opportunity with the big beautiful bill to tweak this and to put expiration dates on it, and they chose to leave geothermal alone. So the geothermal community should know that they have a lot of support from the Trump administration, from the Senate on both sides of the aisle, and from the House on both sides of the aisle. So this tax credit is here to incentivize people to do geothermal, and the checks are getting cut.
All right. So just to kind of wrap up a little bit, I mean, some of the keys to success here, being proactive, having alignment. So more than just eligibility on scope and labor procurement and documentations, that all matters. There's difference between partial value and full credit value and making sure we can substantiate that and how important that is. Again, we keep harping on it. We've harped on it. Every presentation we do, we say it, the earlier the better. So early planning helps. There's a lot of things that can be done when there's the foresight to bring in the experts early and help in the design phase and the procurement phase of these projects to make sure that they're going to be teed up for success on the back end. So, yeah. So, we can get into questions now if we have any.
Thanks, guys. Great presentation. The ITC is always, an interesting topic and sometimes can be confusing. So that was really helpful to go through those discussion points for sure. We do have questions. Our first question is from Aaron. He asks, is the 284-ton limit based on nameplate capacity of the heat pumps, which can be higher than theoretical diversified load that the systems are designed for? So what's your thought on that as far as the requirements for prevailing wages?
No, it's based on the limiting factor. So it's whichever one of the two is the lesser of, whether it's the diversified load or what its system actually sized to. So, I mean, Josh, I don't know if you want to expand on that a little bit, but.
Yeah, so it's based on, there's several ways of going about it that they've given us, several ways to calculate it, but it's the capacity of the system for one. So you can either add up all your heat pumps to get your capacity of your system, or you can do an engineering analysis on the well field to determine your well field's capacity. And that's one or the other. And then it's also, you also have to do capacity from a heating standpoint and from a cooling standpoint and determine the capacity of each. And if either one's over a megawatt, then you're over a megawatt. So that's kind of the short of it.
So it sounds like documentation is pretty important there so that you can defend that calculation.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. If you're especially, the closer you get to that 284 tons, you want to be able to defend it on both sides.
Very good. John has a question. Can you comment on domestic content with respect to the bore field specifically? My understanding is our clients can't take credit for vertical exchanger piping. Let me see here. There's some more. And lateral piping because they're considered construction materials.
Yeah, I'm not sure why they would while that would be the case. I mean, they are construction materials, but that's not excluded. So, the domestic content is the whole system from the well field all the way to the register. So everything in between counts. I mean, we didn't go into a lot of the caveats. There's multi-use things. If you have a chiller on there, you may get discounted on some of the stuff that's downstream of the chiller, for instance, and things of that nature. But domestic content analysis is done from pipe to register. The only exception would be structural steel. Structural steel gets exempted out of the domestic content calculation. It's got its own standalone requirement of being 100% domestic content. But outside of structural steel, everything gets analyzed.
Okay, thank you. Carl has a question. Can you compare the domestic content requirements to BABA, Build America, Buy America Act? If a piece of equipment is BABA compliant, is it automatically domestic content compliant?
No, that's a good question. No is the answer. The short answer. BABA is a little bit different. In some ways more strict, and other ways less strict. But it's BABA doesn't go all the way to the level of detail that ITC domestic content goes to. So you can be BABA compliant, but you're not really not compliant with anything, because again, BABA is kind of doing it on a piece by piece, right? So BABA is saying this component has to meet BABA requirements. Every component that you use has to meet BABA requirements. What ITC does is say the system as a whole has to meet domestic content requirements, right? So you can use heat pumps that don't meet BABA requirements. That's fine, as long as you've got enough domestic content elsewhere to bring the project up over your required minimum. So it's two entirely different calculations that we're working through when we're dealing with those two. And we may have to do both on a particular project. If you're doing a federal job, we may have to look at both, but it is two different things.
Okay, very good. Dimitri has a question about the split approach. Can you provide more details on the split approach, the big multi-asset projects which have 1 megawatt on smaller pieces and others that are less than a megawatt?
Yeah, I mean, I think it'd be good to have a one-on-one conversation if you got that situation. But that's the aggregation rules. So there's a handful of rules that you have to go through that that you need to check or not check, depending on if you want to combine all the systems or if you want to split them up. Things like, did you pull the permit for each system at the same time? Is it all under one permit or separate permits? Are they being financed all under one financing agreement, or are they separate financing agreements? There's little questions like this that you have to go through in order to be able to split the system up. The other thing is, does it operate as one system, right? So kind of one of the things that we're looking at is your entire geothermal field all on one pumping loop? So that kind of would make the case that all these buildings are on one system, versus do we have, this piece of the well field going into this building and it's on its own pumping loop? So there's just lots of ways that we have to break this up, and it's really an iterative process that we go through as we're looking at each job to try to say, you don't have to do this, but if you do, it's going to look better in terms of being an independent system. It doesn't, versus, and then letting the project developer and the project owner kind of make these internal decisions of how much risk they're willing to take in order to say that we've broken this up correctly or that we've aggregated it correctly.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of looked at it where if you're gonna, it's highly facts and circumstance based. I mean, it really, every time I think we've seen every scenario, somebody shows up with a new scenario that is a completely different set of facts and circumstances and has to be kind of relooked at from. So the amount of conditional statements in there are pretty drastic when it comes to the aggregation rules. So
good to have experts working on that for sure. So Brett has a question. Please clarify the expiration dates of ITCs for both residential and commercial projects. I may have misunderstood, but I thought that these ITCs were unavailable altogether beyond 2025 per federal legislation.
Right. Yeah. It starts phasing out in 33. Did you say 25 or 35?
25.
Oh, no.
I think he's
I thought
thinking
you
about the
said
residential.
35.
Probably talking
Yeah,
about
maybe.
25D, the residential tax credit, which did
Yeah,
expire.
this is all, this whole webinar is all about commercial.
Thank you. John has a question here about definitions for non-mechanical engineer folks. What do you mean by register? Isn't there a distinction between what components of the system are eligible if greater than 50% of the system demand can be obtained by the earth/geothermal versus supplemental equipment if it's a hybrid system?
Not super clear on the question, but yeah, if it's a hybrid system, so you have to be over 50% geothermal usage, right? And that's going to be by, um, you know, I mean, it's supposed to be based on, not capacity, but like your typical usage of the system. And so we'll create like an energy model to prove out how this building's going to function. So if you're on a multi-use system, the geothermal has to contribute over 50% in order to get the ITC for the geothermal part of the. If you're under 50%, there's no ITC money coming for geothermal. Once you achieve that over that 50%, now we're having to break up even some of the costs of this system. Say we're at 55% geothermal, so the ductwork's going to be 55%. Maybe the heat pumps, depending on how they're tied into the system, maybe we only get 55% of those. So it's very unique depending on each project. But I think the big takeaway is that your geothermal has to contribute over 50% of the heating and cooling into the building before you're eligible for the ITC.
Thank you, Josh. Robert has a question, and you may not be able to answer this, but what is the approximate cost for this consulting? How early should you be engaged? And would you be willing to give presentations to the Denver Code and stakeholders?
I mean, anywhere $10-20 million per job is our. No, I'm just joking. But no, typically we're our fees based on a fixed fee. Sometimes if you want to kind of look at it and it's going to depend on the project. Each project's going to be unique and based on its size and what different services we're going to have to offer as part of it. So, sometimes I like to say it could be anywhere from like 0.5% to 1% to 10% of the credit amount. It just really depends on, hey, did we have to go and monitor PWA for 2 years on this project, or are we, or not? Are we doing? Is it a simple, cost study that we can knock out real quickly, or is it? So it really ranges on depending on this exact scenario, but I mean, it's definitely a very, very tiny amount compared to the tax credit and the value that we can. And as far as early, we like to get engaged. The earlier, the better. Even if we have to sit here and wait and have contracts that are sitting on hold for years as these projects are getting built until we actually. But at least we know that when we're going to show up on the back end, we're going to be able to support them and get the credits for you. So.
Very good. Well, we are right at 11:30 Central Time. Josh and David's contact information is on the screen. So I know there were still several questions that are certainly above my head. And so feel free to reach out to Josh and David. And thank you so much for your presentation. It was really a lot of great information. You could just tell from our questions and answers that we had a lot of interest. So appreciate your time. This recording will be online in the early next week. So go to IGSHPA.org to look for that recording. And everyone have a great weekend. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.